And we are recording. So welcome to our May Nurturing Cultural Competency and Cultural Humility webcast. We are pleased to have you here at this Province One webcast. We are also very pleased to, as we have been doing over the last few years now, welcoming someone who has a lot of experience in our topic for tonight, which is youth formation and cultural humility and diversity. And so we have the pleasure of having a dear friend of mine, Linnae Peterson, with us, who is the Formation Network Coordinator for the Episcopal Diocese of New Hampshire. So welcome, Linnae. Thank you for being here. And so as with all of our webcasts, we like to start off with an opening prayer, and then we'll launch into the discussion. And Linnae is going to just share a few thoughts, and we'll hopefully have a little bit of time toward the end for a little bit of Q&A, and we'll close out with a closing prayer. So if you would, let us pray. O gracious and ever-loving God, we thank you for bringing us through this day. We thank you for bringing us to this time and to this place where we together can share our thoughts, share our experiences, share how we can form and shape our youth, which will also, I pray, give insights into how we can shape ourselves into the hands and feet in the world that you want us to be, with humility toward all cultures and all types of people. In Jesus' name we pray.
Amen.
Amen. So this is a topic we've been wanting, we the Multicultural Awareness and Cultural Competency Task Force of Province One, we've been wanting to get to this topic for quite some time. And so I'm really glad that we've finally gotten to it, because we know that cultural humility and embracing diversity are keys to living life to its fullest as we seek to become beloved community through the way of love. We know that children as young as 3 years old have developed racial preferences. So we really need to start teaching children at as early an age as possible about cultural humility and embracing diversity, so we stop this tribal behavior we're seeing in our country today, in our society today. We also need to be realistic and looking at just how much we can expect youth who are not fully cognizant of the ways of the world yet to understand. So really looking forward to hearing Linnae's thoughts on how to strike that balance of being age appropriate yet getting the messages across that we need to get and the teachings across that we need to teach our youth as they grow into their own full stature. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Linnae and take it away.
Hi. For those who don't know me, I've been doing Christian formation in various settings, different dioceses, different sized churches, even different denominations. So I've got some idea of how this goes. I'll have a caveat that I have not specifically done a program that deals with this particular topic. I do have some ideas on ways of we can incorporate this into what we're doing with formation in general. That being the case, I'm going to lay out a couple of pieces of information that should help us structure things. The first has to do with spiritual development. Just like children develop physically, emotionally, psychologically, there's also progression of spiritual development. Most folks look at it in terms of ages. The ages vary according to the kid, just like any other developmental progression. The youngest kids focus on wonder. They're looking to learn the language of God's love, is the best way I can describe it. That goes from 0 till about 4 or 5. I think of it as pre-readers, is probably the best way to think of it that way. Once they're 5 to about 11 or 12, they're focused on justice. They want to know what the rules are. They want to know who's in and out. They want to know what they should do and shouldn't do. And they're passionate about things being fair. From about 11 or 12 to 16 or 17, they're interested in community, in learning where they fit in this community of faith, where they're piece of it. And as you work on upwards, young adults and adults all the way up to who knows what are questioning. They're trying to see the answers to things. How do things work? Where do I fit? Where does my thinking fit? And the last stage that people talk about is wisdom, which actually circles back to that idea of wonder. But wonder in a way that encompasses everything they've been through. So it kind of gives you a framework of what we're dealing with. However, most churches have very few kids, very few adults for that matter. So we're usually dealing with how do we talk about these things intergenerationally? We can't really have age segregated classes. We've only got 1 or 2 people in that age group. So we have to think about how are we going to do these in a way that encompasses all ages. It's particularly difficult because the church is one of the very few places where we work intergenerationally, but it's also our strength. So you can work either way. Do any of you work with larger churches that have graded classes?
No.
No. No. Okay. That just helps me tailor what I'm going to say. So Christian formation is lifelong. It goes from cradle to grave. Life deep. It covers all the areas of who we are. And it's like wide. It touches on everything that we do. So there's ways of bringing that together. For our purpose tonight, I kept thinking about how basically we're talking about how are we the same and how are we, and that's true across the board. We're constantly dealing with this balance between same and different. We're the same as other people, but we're also different than other people. We're different. So that's kind of where my brain was going. The other piece of it is we're all dealing in very small communities, very small church communities. The question is, how do we get out of these little silos that we live in? And how do we connect with people who are outside of those groups. So if you're working with a group that includes very young children, one of the things is to use storybooks, and I've got a list that I can give of the ones I've run across. There are hundreds out there. But also videos. You tap into Sesame Street. There are all kinds of pieces like that that you can use. And if you're using them with your kids, you can incorporate adults by having them read the storybook to the kids, having them be part of the conversation, watch whatever the video is together, along with a guided conversation. That would be one way to do it. There are ways you can kind of split the difference there. Once you get to elementary age kids who are so passionate about justice, talking about how things are fair or aren't fair. One of the things I ran across in my research for this is a game called Barn. Has anybody run into this?
What is it?
What is Barnga?
Can you type that in?
RNGA. It's essentially a card game where you have groups playing the card game, and each group has a slightly different set of rules, and you move up or down between the groups. And you think you're working with your set of rules, but the table's working with a different set of rules. So as you mix people up, you realize that there's something going on that you don't understand because your rules are slightly different than everybody else's. Games are a great way to teach kids. I also ran across a geography program, which I thought was fascinating. They Skype with a group from another locality. They can only ask yes or no questions, and they have to try to figure out who the other people are. So by doing that, you learn all kinds of things about those people and about yourself. And you're the same or you're different. And I started thinking about this. Wouldn't it be fun to do it with a church near you in the same diocese, a church further away, even a church around the world, and depending on the age and the tendency of your group, you could increase the distance of the difference distance, if that makes sense. So that you could get people used to figuring out how you're the same and how you're different.
So that would kind of be you could set something like that up kind of at the diocesan level if there isn't if there's not more than one parish in your city or more than one church in the city. Maybe that's something at the diocesan level that the diocese can say, maybe this one day of the month we're going to have Skype set up and have this kind of back and forth conversation done.
Yeah. I was thinking about it just in terms of New Hampshire. We're in southern New Hampshire. To do something way up on the border, like in Berlin, where there's a very different economic situation. Up on the Canadian border. And that would be really interesting. But you don't tell the people in the group where people are. They have to figure it out from these yes and no questions.
Right.
There are also some children's issue books that I've run across. One has to do with homelessness, one about hunger, one about difference that I just ran across called. There's another one on war and children in war, and they're geared toward kids. So they're accessible to the story, and to talk about what it's like when you're living in a different context in a different world. So it's a good introduction for that. Those are mostly for lower elementary kids, but even some of the older ones, you can find some. And I'm sure your local librarian, I'm heavily in favor of children's librarians for this. Go talk to them. They're a wealth of information. Be very helpful.
And this is probably also a good point to mention that I should say, Linnae and I both attend St. Matthew's in Goffstown, New Hampshire. So we do a few things together. And some of you may have heard of our Courageous Conversations series that we put on over the past 3 months. And our last event, our last Courageous Conversation is happening tomorrow night. But we've been working very closely with our library. Our library is a partner along with St. Matthew's and with the Granite State Organizing Project, the NAACP, and
St. Anselm's.
and Crispin's House, our local student high school group. And they've got a number of books that they've identified as being books to read around the topic of diversity and racism. So we don't have to be the ones to necessarily come up with all of these and put these things on ourselves. We can absolutely partner with our town libraries or city's libraries to provide resources as well.
On the resource list, I do have a number of books that are, I call them church books. They're books that are geared to Christianity and that strand of spirituality. And some of those are particularly good in terms of the visuals, where they're very engaging in terms of a diversity of people in the pictures. And sometimes art styles are helpful too. But those books are helpful to have in your church library. And more than that, one of the things I've found with church books is to put them out at coffee hour to highlight certain books. People have a tendency to pick them up if they're there. Pretend you're the librarian, and just like they highlight books by season, do this with these books as well, and have them available. And you'll see that people will pick them up if you start talking about something and say, oh, how about this one? How about this one? It really makes a big difference in terms of people engaging with it.
And I think along with that, if you can tie the books into the sermon for the day, or for the readings for the day, or for the Sunday school lesson for the day, then you can kind of, during the rector or whoever's giving the sermon can give a plug for a book that's downstairs or wherever to pick it up later on. The Sunday school teachers can give a plug to the parents to pick up the book, or even the kids to go look at the book that's out there.
Yeah. Middle school and high school. The thing that came to mind is these kids like connections. They want to find where they fit. So for if you could connect with another community and do some kind of tandem service project, perhaps, or a learning project that they can both be doing, and then, get them so they can talk to each other about it, would be a great opportunity. And again, this can be a whole church community. You could do a service project you decide upon with another community. They do it in their community, you do it in yours, and then you have a conversation at the beginning to figure out what you're doing, in the middle to talk about how it's going, and at the end to talk about how it went. Do this as a whole church. It doesn't have to be just middle school students or the high school students or whatever, but think about it as intergenerational. The other thing that's come up recently for me is that most people have not been taught how to think ethically. And there are various ways online, but they've not been taught how to think through a situation in terms of right and wrong, ethics, the old Catholic term of virtues. And that would be a great thing to think about as you put something together to include that as part of it, both for the adults and for the kids. And for the adults to be able to show the kids how to do that. But most adults haven't done that. They haven't been trained to do that. They do it intuitively, but they've not been taught a process of how to think through that. So,
do you have any resources on the resource sheet that explain how to do that, or pointers to?
I don't. I can put one on before I send it out. I can make sure to do that.
I'd be curious to know if there are any of the existing curricula out there. Sunday school curricula might have something like that.
Not any that I've come across, but I can send out some feelers and find out if there's one that I don't know about that maybe does.
Yeah, that'd be a good forma question.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly where I'm going to go.
Right. I haven't seen any of them either, but someone may have created one. I know there are a lot of people out there creating their own kind of curricula or pieces of curricula because of what you just raised. There's certain topics that just aren't taught except somewhat through the very basic biblical stories that we see in curricula.
Yeah. For high school students, as you're moving up, one of the things to think about is to be aware of what they're taking in a high school, to connect that in and what events are going around in the community so that you can bring that into the conversation with whatever you're doing. To be able to say, I know that in high school you have to take X. Can you tell us what you're learning in that? That, that seems like it's part of this. So to be sure and connect with where they are and what they're learning, it would be a great thing to do.
Yeah, so this is also perfect. We can talk about, what Tina Philippot, who's our English teacher in the high school, what she does with her kids, just to give an example of what Linnae is talking about. We're understanding what the teachers are doing in the school. So our English teacher actually gives an assignment to her honors English class for the kids to investigate their own family history and to write something about how their families came together and the different cultures and different backgrounds that make them up. So if you know that your teachers are doing something like that, as Linnae is saying, incorporate that into one of your lessons.
Yeah. And the other thing is, at least in my experience, I have a son who just finished his freshman year in college, so I'm still kind of in touch with that whole high school, college world. Podcasts, StoryCorps, movies, shows, anything that is kind of out there. If you haven't read Patricia Lyon's book on teaching faith using Harry Potter, please do. And she gives that as an example for how to use cultural touchstones as a way to talk about faith and talk about all the kinds of things that we're talking about. In Harry Potter, you have the whole division between wizards and muggles and how that fits into things. And that might be an easier way to talk about the subject in some ways, because it's a step removed, and you can talk about what the ramifications of that are, and then come back to our world. It's one of the things the old Star Trek used to do all the time in many science fiction books, is by talking about the issues in other worlds, you can bring them back in the end and talk about our world, but you move so that people don't get quite as upset and quite as around the topic until after they've had a chance to kind of dig through it. So that's one thing that you could think about.
Yeah.
And again, all those things are things that people could listen to as a group for probably middle school, high school, adults, and then have the conversation around it.
I think Ellen just raised her hand. Ellen, did you have a question or want to say something or want to type something in?
Thank you. I did. I wanted to go back to the intergenerational and getting together maybe with another congregation or in a, and work on something together. Mm-hmm. So when you're in your experience, what are the kinds of questions that might stimulate conversation along these lines? I mean, do you say to people, I don't even know how you'd start a conversation about talking about diversity in that situation. So
I guess the questions I would ask are about, tell me about your community. What are the issues in your community? What are the needs in your community? What kinds of things have you already done? What kinds of things have other people done? Does that help? So you need to ask about where they are now, and then and you'd ask those same questions for each community, and you'd see kind of where they overlap, maybe.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you.
What's the need? What's doable? And what's possible?
Mm-hmm. And sometimes, there are videos, and I think there's a comment about the video, the danger of a single story is very good for high school students. So sometimes, and I use this when I do sessions on white privilege and whatnot, I'll show a video, and the video brings up the questions to people. And I after the video, I ask them, what did you think about that video? What prompted you to, what was the one word that you got out of that? What questions do you have out of that movie? Did you see something you had never seen before? And that usually sparks the conversation.
Oftentimes, asking what surprised you is a really good question for any of these things, because surprise is not judgmental. It's just is. Surprised you. What intrigued you? What would you like to know more about? Any of those kinds of questions that are open-ended are really helpful to begin the conversation. There are three things to any program. And this came from Zu Van Ost, who's up in northern Minnesota. To make things intergenerational, to give them something that people can take home and do or discuss. And for those people who couldn't get there that night, that time, is there some way it can go online? So if you're listening to a podcast and you've got a couple of questions, you could easily put that link onto your Facebook page, along with the questions, and give people the opportunity to respond either on Facebook or message you or something like that, so that, you know, I've got to work Thursday night and I can't be there. Well, here's how you can engage, even if you can't physically be there. That's something to think about. Y'all have tons of ideas, I'm sure. Tell me, what are you thinking?
So I think I'm just reading some of the chats here. Elizabeth is saying she likes the question, did you see something you've never seen before? Let's see, we've got a comment. Our Sunday school did cleanup at the ancient burial grounds where the slaves were buried and talked about the dignity of every human being. So that's, I think, another great idea, taking advantage of your geography. If you have a site that's close enough that you can take kids to do that kind of a pilgrimage almost, if you will. And as Linnae was saying before, it's a project the kids do together. And if you can get people from different cultures, different communities actually doing it together, doing that cleanup project, for example, they're interacting with people who are different from them in a way that's very positive and productive. So that's a great comment.
It would be interesting to have people from different communities cleaning up their own graveyards, thinking particularly Memorial Day is traditionally the day when you do that. So maybe next year. And learning a little bit about the people who are buried there and discussing with the other group, which would be great. You know, who's there? Who was there? In Goffstown, we have a large Quebecois French-Canadian group, and talking about how they've been discriminated against over the century that they've been here, is a way in to talk about discrimination of other groups in other places and other groups in this place, so, and how it continues. I just today had the chance to watch PBS biography of Norman Mineta, whom I knew well because he was in San Jose, which is near where I grew up. But it was a really, really interesting story about Japanese American, and he was interned in World War II, and some of the connections that he made with somebody else in Montana who turned out to be another legislator with him in the Congress later on. So it would be an interesting piece to talk about how do you make connections despite prejudice, despite difficulties over difference, big differences. So I commend that to you if you have a chance to see it.
And something else that we're actually doing here in New Hampshire, which might be an interesting youth project or youth getting involved or even intergenerational is that we are, the Black Heritage Trail of New Hampshire actually has been doing work with us to uncover stories of African Americans across the state. And no one really knew that there were so many African Americans who contributed to their communities before. So based on that, what we're about to put forth as a resolution to diocesan convention is encouraging parishes to investigate their cultural history and seeing how different cultures have contributed to what their parishes are today. So I'm looking forward to
great history project for some college or high school student who wanted to dig in, or even a class, a history class.
Right.
It would be a tremendous working project. And depending on where you live, it could be a different group. Whatever groups are underground. One of the hardest things, on my historian hat for a minute, I worked in museum work for a number of years, and one of the most difficult things is to uncover women's stories, especially lower class women, because they leave very little mark in terms of documentation. So minority women, even less so. So that's an interesting piece.
So let's see. Mary says the movie Allegiance with George Takei also covers the Japanese American experience during World War II. Yes.
Yeah.
And the Underground Railroad sites in Iowa. Yeah, using those if you've got them. That's similar to what we're kind of doing with the Black Heritage Trail, using those locations where the African Americans were, where they had their homesteads, as a pilgrimage. And we actually did for Good Friday, we worked with the Black Heritage Trail in Portsmouth last year to do a Good Friday service in Portsmouth along the Black Heritage Trail in Portsmouth. And this year we had 4 communities actually do that same kind of thing in their own local community, going around to different places where African Americans were either lived or had some impact on the city or the town.
Because I grew up on the West Coast, I'm keenly aware that it's not only white and African American, also have issues with Asian minorities and Latino minorities and all of those others. So be aware of that and try to bring that in as well. I think sometimes we get kind of focused on African American and white. I think that's particularly true of the East Coast. But there are other communities and that kind of thing. There's a great app that I stumbled across not too terribly long ago that can tell you what native tribe you're living in.
Oh yeah, we actually, was that on this? I was on a webcast where we talked about that. There are a couple of websites that do that. So here we've got, here in New Hampshire, in Manchester, we're the Pennacook Abenaki tribe.
Yeah.
The Pennacook is part of the Abenaki Nation.
Yeah. Knowing whose land you live on and a little bit about them is a great thing to think about. Any other questions, issues?
feel free to type in chat if you don't want to come off mute and actually speak. But this is there's a lot of great content here. And in Linnae, I love the way that how you kind of framed it at the different age levels and age groups, and then talked about how to potentially intergenerationalize, if that's a word.
It is now.
It wasn't before, it is now. But how to intergenerationalize it.
A couple of people talked about consistency of attendance.
Right, yes.
Is an issue, period. It's an issue with formation. It's an issue with church attendance. 15 years ago, the average person, if they were a regular attender, came twice a month. Now it's closer to once a month. So whatever you do, if you're going to capture the majority of your group, you have to do it over 4 weeks, or you have to make a big deal out of it, or, as we talked about before, make sure they can access at least part of it digitally. So you're never going to, doing something one Sunday will never get everybody. Just not going to happen. When you consider, this last statistic, something like 40 to 50% of people work on Sunday. So how you're going to capture them on their one Sunday off? Are you going to do it on an evening, or are you going to do it on a Saturday, or are you going to do it some other way? And I'm sure Elizabeth Rain could, as I know she deals with it all the time too. So, but that's just the reality of the situation, and you have to figure out other ways to.
And I think that is the challenge that we're facing overall, that we've got fewer and fewer people coming to church on Sundays consistently anyway, except for a number of us diehards. And so we need programs that need ways to reach people outside of Sunday. Formation needs to happen outside of Sunday just as well. A couple of comments. Becky mentioning using the 400th anniversary of the landing of the Pilgrims to look at how it can work together on the impact of two cultures meeting. So that's great. It's taking advantage of the area and what's happened in the area in the past, and a celebration there. And that I think is a great way to bring people together who may not have ever been together before.
Plymouth Plantation has wonderful Wampanoag resources. So, if you're going to deal with that, I would definitely look at their website, the resources they have, and even call them. They're great in terms of helping you think through that.
Yes, well, we're working with the local Wampanoags here on Cape Cod. This is Becky.
Yeah.
You don't have to go to Plymouth if you live on Cape Cod.
Yeah.
We landed Provincetown first.
Yeah.
They were here for a month before they went over there.
Absolutely.
Just a little bit of Cape Coddy routine.
A little bit of history for us all.
Yes.
Yeah.
Remember, my last name is Alden.
And Becky, did I tell you that my wife is descendant from Alden?
Oh, well, there's another cousin. What do you know?
Yeah.
They only had a first generation of 11 children, so I'm constantly running into cousins.
Yeah.
My family was in Jamestown when the Pilgrims arrived.
And Jane actually mentioned something very interesting, using the calendar of saints now that it is a bit more diverse than it was many moons ago. And I think, rolling that into Sunday school lessons would be great as we try to roll readings from the liturgy into Sunday school lessons in the first place, but into formation.
It would be fun to take a bunch of those saints, hand it out to various people in the congregation, have them do a little research, and then bring back the information, maybe on All Saints. Hand it out in September and have them bring it back in November and share it with everybody.
Oh. Gee, wouldn't that be a great All Saints kind of sermon, if you will, sermon by the people who did the research?
Right.
Yeah, I mean, you could do it any time that would work. It just struck me as that would be a logical thing.
All right. See, and Mary says, abstracting a story a month from the calendar of saints under the heading of real people.
Yeah.
There's the idea for once a month. Yeah.
And you could start expanding that to other people outside the saints, other people that you know of through the history of the church or the history of the church in other places would be.
When we had our electing convention on Saturday, it was Thurgood Marshall's was the saint of the day.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the professors from Middlebury College gave a very nice reflection on him for us.
Very cool.
Great.
Yeah.
Great. And I was also just thinking, every month is designated, and I did this as for our diversity committee for the diocese. We identified a book per month, and each month is dedicated to some unique culture or race. So we all know about February being Black History Month, but there's a Women's Month, there's a Native Americans Month, there's Mother's Day, but every month has some, and I can probably pull it up and see it, but every month has some celebration of some race or culture. So there's an idea, just like there's the All Saints, the saints for every month or whatever it is, you can use that potentially as a...
Again, you can pull out books and stick them on the table at coffee hour, have some for the kids.
Right.
Or for different reading levels that people can take home and read with their kids or their grandkids. Remember, it's only parents, it's also grandparents, it's also godparents, it's aunts and uncles that interact with kids. So, encourage people that there are opportunities to interact with kids and teens in their lives outside of church.
So, we haven't really talked much about kind of the theological aspects of the formation and the teaching. So, Linnae, do you have any thoughts around when do you really start making it theological versus leaving the theology out of it?
Well, I guess I always think theologically, so I have a hard time leaving theology out of it at any point. Our baptismal covenant has us connecting with other people. And so that is one way to talk about any of this, is that we are part of God's family. We are, especially if you're talking church to church, we're all part of the Christian household. if you're talking about saints, that's an important piece of it. How do these people live out their faith? And so that's one question to ask as you're talking about people. How is this living out our faith in terms of actions, and how did they live out their faith? And what does that teach us about living the Christian life? And so those are kind of pieces of it. One of the great things about doing things intergenerationally is we all have different personalities and different learning styles and different ways of thinking about things. And if our parents are similar to us and they're our only example of how to live the Christian faith, then kids and teens will go, well, I couldn't possibly be a Christian because I can't be like that person. However, if you've got a wide variety of people who live out their faith in many different ways, you can say, well, I'm sort of like Jean that I see, and sort of like Mrs. Smith, and sort of like somebody else. And I can say, I can live a Christian faith that is not similar to my parents or my youth pastor or the rector of my church, but it's similar to other people and how they've lived out their Christian faith. So that's a very important piece about doing things intergenerationally, connecting kids with a wide variety of people who are living out the faith.
And I was just thinking about the other piece that we've been talking so much about, understanding and appreciating different cultures and races. I wanted to also bring in the kind of the teaching the humility piece of the puzzle. And I think what you just said, pointing out people who are living their faith and showing how they're being, how humble they're being as they live out their faith. And respecting and being and respecting the fact that they're from a different culture, and yet they're living out their Christian faith as according to the baptismal covenant.
And learning, that's part of humility. We learn from others. Mm-hmm. We don't know it all. None of us know it all. And we always, if we can put ourselves in a position of learning and of receptivity, then I guess humility is a word that fits with that. Mm-hmm. I think of it as, I don't know everything. I will never know everything. I'm always in a position of learning.
And I think along with that, showing that one culture is not necessarily the right culture. And that to me is also humility, understanding that my culture is not necessarily the right culture, the only one. There are other cultures that are equally as important and equally as valid. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we've got about 5 minutes left. And I think this has been a great conversation, and some great tips have been shared, which is exactly what we want to have happen during these conversations, during these webcasts. Any last thoughts? Anything you want to share about what you've been doing, or any questions for Linnae about ideas that may have sprung to mind as we've been having the discussion? Any other events coming up in your local areas that might be a springboard for youth formation? like Becky mentioned, the 400th anniversary event that's coming up and out on the Cape. That's a great opportunity.
So I would like to St. James, New London, Connecticut received a grant to run anti-racism training for students in high school this summer, and we've been planning that all year, and it's going to happen on Fridays during the summer. And so they are groups of 3 from different high schools, 3 or more students from different high schools that will get together and work together on how to deal with racism in their schools. So we have people who have already been doing this work as the staff, and but it's pretty. We had to try it on and step out and face it. So I ask for your prayers for that.
We certainly will keep that in our prayers. It's I think a good step of the church being interactive with the school. So good luck with that. And interviewing older members, that takes me back to one of the things that when my daughter was in elementary school, I think, they had the class go to one of our local nursing homes, and they had the kids interview people at the nursing home to see the different ages and create that bond. So that's an interesting concept of having kids interview the older people in the parish and get their things.
There's a StoryCorps app that you can get that includes help with doing that and recording it, and includes help with figuring out the questions and how best to do that, which would be a great thing to do.
And with that, I mean, those stories are at the diocesan level. I know in New Hampshire, at least, and I know in Connecticut, and I know in Maine, and I know in Vermont, and I know in Massachusetts, the dioceses are looking for those stories. They want to have those stories and make them available on the websites. So they get spread, the stories get spread across the diocese and across the church.
Somebody asked about ecumenical and interreligious. I don't know now, but I'm going to have a meeting with the director of the New Hampshire Council of Churches to talk about how we can talk about formation across denominations, possibly broader than that. We'll see where it goes. If you have a chance, if you don't know about the Tri-Faith Initiative in Omaha, they've got a mosque, a synagogue, and a UCC church that have sold properties, bought a property together. They're each building worship spaces, and they're sharing education and administrative and outreach ministry space. That's a really interesting thing that's happening, that if you want to kind of look at how they're making that dialogue happen. In terms of kids, always inviting people of other faiths to have a conversation and to teach them how they worship. My son's elementary school in Delaware had a Episcopal school, but it had kids from a number of different faiths, and they would invite their parents to come in and talk about what they did, how they worshiped, what their holidays were. Kids could connect to.
Yeah, good. Well, I see by the clock on the wall we are at the half hour. Our time is up. So thank you, Linnae, for a great, rich conversation, some great tips and thoughts. And we'd like to close out with a closing prayer. Let us pray. O gracious and heavenly Father, who has brought all things into this world, we thank you for the opportunity to share these thoughts and ideas. We thank you for bringing Linnae to us at this time, and the opportunity to discuss this very important topic for the life of the church and for the world. Send us out into the world in peace. Grant us strength and courage to hold fast to what is dear and to live into the word that you brought to us through your Son, Jesus Christ, in whose name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
And
Thank
you all for coming.
This is the last webcast for our program year. We will pick it back up probably in the September timeframe, I think, for the September webcasts. We'll, I think, continue on with our third Tuesdays. If you have topics that you would like for us to cover for the next year, please make sure you send them to Executive Director at province1.org, and Julie Lytle, our Executive Director, will capture those and bring those to us on the task force as we put together our topic list for next year. So thank you all again for coming. Thanks again to Linnae for being here, and have a great summer, and we'll see you in the fall.
Thank you.
Thank you, James.
Can I say something?
Yes.
So I'm in Oregon, and for some reason I was thinking, I guess